Welcome. In 2019, the Bipartisan Policy Center launched its Campus Free Expression Project as one component of our response to the stresses on our democracy. The Campus Free Expression Project is housed within BPC's Democracy Program. My name is Matthew Weil, and I lead the Democracy Program. Our work includes the Elections Project, our Structural Democracy Project that makes recommendations to improve the functioning of Congress and other electoral systems, and our American Congressional Exchange Project, which brings a Republican-Democratic pair of US representatives to visit each other's districts to learn about their constituencies and priorities. Just as important as BPC's work on Congress and election integrity, however, is the work of preparing the next generation of citizen leaders. BPC's Campus Free Expression Project works to restore open discourse on college campuses to create independent thinkers and engaged citizens. That project is led by Jackie Pfeffer-Merrill, who in just a moment will introduce today's panelists and moderate the conversation. The event today will focus on a new book, Cancel Wars: How Universities Can Foster Free Speech, Promote Inclusion, and Renew Democracy, by our guest, Civic Ben-Porath. As the title indicates, her book focuses on exactly the concerns we have at BPC about fostering the health of our democracy and the crucial role higher education plays. Jackie, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction and framing the work that we do in the Campus Free Expression in the context of our work to support a robust democracy here at BPC. In today's charged political climate, fear of expressing views that are in contrast with those of the dominant in-group orthodoxy undermines the health of our democracy. And that is particularly worrying when it happens on our college campuses, where the very core of the mission is to stress test ideas. We're also very concerned with the work of the BPC's Academic Leaders Task Force, and as we view the landscape on college campuses, in which the ways in which we can, as campus communities, include all of those in campus debates and conversations, including those who have been historically underrepresented at our college campuses, and make sure that we have a robust intellectual exchange that feels safe and welcoming for all. Today, as Matt Weil mentioned, we're just delighted to welcome Civic Ben-Porath and Dan Cullen to discuss these ideas. Civic Ben-Porath is the author of the new book, Cancel Wars, and she is a professor of philosophy at Philosophy, Education, and Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of many books and articles, including those on the meaning of citizenship, K-12 education and higher education, including questions of school choice and campus free speech. She's going to be in conversation with Dan Cullen, professor of philosophy at Rhodes College, where he also directs the project on liberal democracy. Dan is the author and co-editor of books and articles on Rousseau, liberal democracy, and liberal education. So welcome, Civic, and welcome, Dan. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today. Again, thanks to our audience to join us today. And before I begin the conversation, just a few words about our run of show. I'll moderate a conversation between Dan and Civic for the next 35 minutes or so, but I encourage our audience to ask questions at any time by tweeting to BPC Live or asking questions in the YouTube or Facebook chat function. We may turn to the conversation with questions from the audience at any point. So go ahead and offer your observations about the conversation or your questions. And while I hope everyone will be just focused on the conversation and not ordering a book for the next 55 minutes, I want to thank the University of Chicago Press for offering a discount code UCP-NEW, all caps, University of Chicago Press New, with which viewers can order a or a copy of Civic's book. So Civic, let's just level set our conversation today by turning first to you. So starting from the problem of political polarization, you argue that universities can't just be ivory towers, that they have a real responsibility to address this kind of polarization that we see today. And you argue for the importance of a sort of Dewey style, I think you call it at one point, engaged political culture that's based on an understanding of a kind of civic trust. And I want to come back in just a few moments to the connection between the truth-seeking mission of higher education and the civic mission of higher education. But I'd like to begin with this question of building a community of trust on a college campus. You worry that free speech is sometimes wielded as a tool of exclusion. And in order to address that, we need to define boundaries of expression. And that puts you at odds with some others, including those like Justice Brandeis, or more, in a more contemporary way, Erwin Chemerinsky, who really say speech should be unbounded on a college campus. So just to start us out, can you just, why is it that we should see the need for boundaries of expression on a college campus, and what are those boundaries?
Thank you so much, Jackie, for this question, and thank you and the Bipartisan Policy Center for inviting me to speak today with Daniel about these important issues that we all worry about. My sense is that defining together and upholding the boundaries of acceptable expression is a core aspect of sustaining free speech on a college campus. So what's important for me is not that I come out and define very clearly, you know, here are the correct boundaries that I, you know, from my expertise can impart upon anyone, or here are the words that everyone should or shouldn't say. Here are the perspectives that are beyond the pale and you should never voice them. I don't think this is the appropriate approach to thinking about boundaries. I think the boundaries of expression, norms about how we shouldn't speak, what we shouldn't consider, are actually an essential part of a free and inclusive environment. And they are going to be quite distinct on different college campuses, in different classrooms, in student clubs and events, you know, so the norms are not stable, and this is part of what characterizes them. And what we all have to be open to is the intentional effort to think together about defining the norms that are at the foundation of a conversation we're having, and then negotiating them in a way that is inclusive and open.
So Sigal, there, you know, I appreciate no certain word or no definite rules, and maybe a variety on campus to campus. But you mentioned a couple principles in your books: intellectual risks and dignitary safety. Are those the principles with which we should think about these boundaries? And if so, what can you tell us a little bit more about those principles and how you would define them?
Great. Yes, thank you. So my sense is that in order to really work through the core mission, as you noted, of a higher education institution, the conversation that we are having has to include intellectual risks. And intellectual risks, which are really coupled with intellectual humility, right, are really just the core principles of an open inquiry, right? You are basically saying, I come into this conversation with my knowledge, with my beliefs, with my understanding of the world or the answers to the questions that we are asking together. And you come with yours, and each of us sort of like come from their own, you know, set of experiences or prior knowledge or books we've read or perspectives and values we have. And then what we ought to do together is to try and take them as tentative, right? And so the intellectual risks that we are taking is basically saying, well, what if I'm wrong? What if there is another perspective that I didn't think about? What if somebody, maybe you, can shed a completely new light or a slightly new light on the question that we are asking together? So intellectual risks are really at the heart of our work. But in order to really benefit from the process, what we ought to be able to do is to make sure that everyone knows that they can participate in the conversation, right? So if we are in a classroom or we are in whichever other shared context, hopefully face-to-face, right, which is increasingly the case on college campuses today, then we ought to make sure that everyone who is a part of the conversation knows that they are a valued member of the community of learning, that they really are welcome and belong in the class or the context, and that everyone around them knows that, right? So that especially for young people, but really for everyone, they know that they are not risking shaming, humiliation, snickers, I mean, they're not really putting themselves at risk of a social rejection by voicing their opinions. And so the notion of dignitary safety is really, I don't know if it's a boundary, maybe it's a boundary, and maybe it's just the foundation of an effective conversation in which intellectual risks can be taken. I have to know that I can trust you, that you see me as an equal, that you appreciate my contributions as such, even when they are wrong, right? You appreciate my efforts to contribute, and only then can I really contribute as an equal member. And so these are really the maybe defining features of an effective conversation.
Dan, I see you trying to jump in here. Would you want to jump in right at this moment?
Well, I think I'm happy to, but I might want to back up and take a bit of a wider angle lens on Sigal's book for a moment and try and bring out what I think is the essential argument, but also maybe the most contestable aspect of the book. Sigal, I learned much from your book. It's the most powerful case, detailed, carefully argued argument that our standard interpretation of the rules of engagement surrounding free speech and free expression on campus and in society are fundamentally flawed. I think it has many compelling details, but I'd like to just make a couple of general comments about what I noticed in the argument and try and get your response to it. And I have to say I'm somewhat skeptical of what I think is the core argument in the second chapter, that the civic and epistemological missions of the university are mutually reinforcing in the way that you suggest they are. I agree that inclusion and knowledge seeking are not necessarily incompatible, but again, I'm skeptical of the prediction that respect for dignitary safety will actually improve inquiry. And a related point, I'm intrigued by your description of the university as comprising two domains that seem, in your view, to have equal status: a social civic domain that is within the university, separate from, although overlapping with, the knowledge-seeking learning domain. And you argue, I think, that there are two conceptions of freedom associated with those respective domains. But it was ambiguous to me whether you thought that the civic domain is more tolerant of free expression or less, to the extent that it's already part of the wider public sphere. One would think it ought to be more tolerant of expression, because the public sphere itself is often much the worse for it. But it seems to me that dignitary safety obviously imposes more limits on free expression than obtained now in the public realm. So I was a bit confused as to exactly how you saw freedom operating in each of those separate domains and how they might mutually reinforce one another. And lastly, I think it might be helpful to put this out there. I think what's really important about your argument is that it directly challenges what I would say is the most powerful existing case for an alternative conception of the university, which has consequences for how we view free speech and political action within it. And it's the famous Calvin report of the University of Chicago, not to be confused with the Chicago Statement, Calvin report from 1967, on the university's role in social and political action. And let me quote what I think is a key.
Dan, before you do that, I'm going to exercise my prerogative as moderator, because I want to make sure that we have a chance to not lose the earlier important questions that you've asked, because I think the Calvin report is a really important one. So I wanted to go back to where all the questions that Dan asked are worthy of engagement, but not all of us have your book in front of us yet, Sigal. I hope everyone's going to be ordering it in about 45 minutes. But I want to read from chapter 2, and exactly on this question that I think Dan was pointing to, on the connection between the civic mission, which has historically been seen as an important part of our American requirements and idea of higher education, and the truth-seeking or the knowledge-seeking mission of higher education. So you write, the civic mission of higher education requires limits on ideas that are exclusionary, undermine the dignitary safety of members of the community, or challenge members belonging to the community on account of their social identities or immutable characteristics. And that in a way, balances or lets the civic mission of higher education have some sort of check, at least when we're dealing with students, or particularly undergraduate students, on the ways in which we engage in that truth-seeking or knowledge-seeking. So could you just explicate that claim about the check of the civic mission on the truth-seeking mission?
Great, thank you both so much. This is really a challenging issue that goes to the core of both my argument in the book, but also really the challenges that we are facing in higher education institutions right now. And so I'd like to differentiate between formal restrictions on speech and shared norms regarding speech, right? I think these two are often confused and are really important to keep apart. So, of course, the truth-seeking mission of universities requires that we sustain the broadest formal boundaries of expression possible, so that heterodox views, maybe dissenting views, unpopular areas of research can openly and freely be explored. And this is how we advance knowledge, and this is how we are able to push forward in various ways, social, technological, whichever they might be. At the same time, for me, it's really important to keep in mind that the open boundaries of expression sometimes invite in views that might be exclusionary, right? And this is actually where these two areas collide, right? Because sometimes we can be unhappy about a dissenting view regarding, I don't know, somebody claiming that the earth is flat, right? So this is a dissenting view. It's obviously an unpopular view, right? People in the discipline of, I don't know, geography or astronomy might be unhappy about it, but it's not exclusionary in itself, right? So we have the disciplinary tools to consider and, I suppose, to reject, heterodox views of this type. But when the views are ones that are inviting questions about equal social standing of different social groups. For example, can women be as successful as men in math and science? Do people of racial minorities belong in various contexts, right? Academic contexts. These are questions that some people bring up as heterodox or unpopular or dissenting views, challenges to current views regarding who belongs. And so these are views that in themselves are both dissenting and challenging, but they are also at their core exclusionary, right? So they are trying to say, well, Jackie, if you want to be actually, in math or science, tough luck, we are not thinking that you can actually succeed there. Not by virtue of your current achievement or capacities, but because you're a woman. So the boundaries that I'm trying to set are not boundaries that would disallow or in some official way punish somebody who is stating views such as the ones I just mentioned, but rather boundaries that are setting norms regarding the kind of condition that the conversation can support, so that you, Jackie, or anyone else, right, as in my examples, can in fact effectively participate and make a contribution. For me, this is not just a civic role, right? And I'm saying this for me as, a philosopher or a scholar, but it's also for me as a teacher, as a person who works in higher education, as a person who goes around visiting different colleges and universities and working with them on their policies. So we can go back to the Calvin Report and the Chicago Statement as well later. Setting these boundaries or norms in a productive way really is not only just civic or social. It's not only just a way of being nice to all the students or including them or creating a touchy-feely environment. It's really a way of making sure that we all benefit from everyone's perspectives and knowledge, that we can actually learn from the beliefs and the experiences and the knowledge and the background that everyone can bring with them. If we are not clearly setting boundaries that protect everyone's participation or dignitary safety, as I said, then as a society, we are losing half or a third or however much of our talent pool. We are really not able to benefit from everyone's abilities and smart brains and interesting perspectives. So the reason for thinking about what you just quoted from my book, Jackie, the civic sort of like conditions and goals of universities is not secondary to or even distinct from the epistemic or knowledge-based goals. It's really serving the same goal of advancing knowledge.
Well, I want to remind our viewers, I see already some questions coming in, that they can ask a question on Twitter with the hashtag BPC Live or on the chat function on YouTube or Facebook. But Dan, I was trying to, restate your first question to Sigal, and I want to invite you to kind of respond to what she has offered.
Yeah, just briefly, Sigal, I noticed that in a crucial passage in chapter 2, and I know the audience hasn't read the book, you make this interesting point that in an ideal society, there would be clear rules prioritizing the truth-seeking mission and equally prioritizing the civic and social mission, or the building civic capacity mission. But then you point out, in our fallen, polarized reality, clear rules are not an option. And just at the end of your remarks just now, you mentioned that we need clear rules, but it seems to me that was precisely the view expressed in the Chicago statement. You know, we've got a bullet that has to be bitten here, and this is how we're going to do it. Whereas I thought the emphasis throughout your book, right up to the very end, was on that we have to continuously negotiate the boundaries. So you're in favor of boundaries, but they don't seem to be clear and fixed, certainly in the way that the Chicago principles advocate. And you have a lot of faith, I think, in the negotiation process. But I wonder, someone skeptically might think, how much prospect is there of that kind of fruitful negotiation in a campus environment that is indeed divided and even polarized? So that I think is an issue that you might have to say more about. Are the rules going to be shifting over time on the basis of evolving conversations and new thoughts and perhaps new discoveries of threats to dignitary safety? Or are we going to reach some plateau where we actually get it right and do better than the Chicago statement, for example?
That's really an important question, Dan. And I would say that, you know, in reality, in understanding the way in which society currently operates, both in its current more polarized form, but also in better times in this regard, I don't think there is a set of rules that would be appropriate for all contexts, for all universities, across time and the vast space of this country and beyond, right? Because you know that the Chicago statement is now being endorsed by universities in Canada, for example, because of the requirements from some of the provincial governments, despite the fact that in Canada, of course, the rules are quite different and restrictions on speech, legally speaking, are quite distinct from the American ones. So my concern about the Chicago statement and about other similar efforts to set clear, fully stated, and stable boundaries for expression, my concern about it is as follows. First of all, I find value in the negotiation itself. The negotiation indicates that we value your perspective about this. It's an initial way of generating social trust that is material for the process of developing knowledge together. And so the very effort to negotiate the boundaries of what is appropriate in my classroom versus your classroom, in the dorms versus the college Republicans or college Democrats or college thespian club, right? I mean, these are efforts that in themselves have value, and the value is both civic and epistemic. Beyond that, so beyond the value that I find in the process of negotiation, which can help us overcome some of the initial mistrust and polarization, etc., I really think that there is no, let me put it this way, the Chicago statement will not save you, right? Even the best policy that you can come up with, and I do appreciate the Chicago statement as useful for its context and, you know, the institution in which it was built, you know, as you're saying, with the background of the Calvin Report, and the particular population that it serves, and being a selective institution with a particular mission, right? Maybe it's a good fit there. I don't think it will save us from the need to talk about this, to figure out what fits our classrooms, our institutions, and our contexts. And I really worry that the demand coming from, as I said, different politicians and policymakers and political leaders in the US and beyond to endorse the Chicago Statement is really more a stake in the ground than it is an actually productive effort to sustain free speech and create an environment that's conducive to research and to the civic goals of the university. My sense is that it's more a political or sometimes power move to try and say, well, all of your concerns about exclusion and about your voice is not being heard, sit aside. What we are doing here is for adults, and adults talk about everything. And I think, it's fine if this is what somebody wants to say, but I think it's not very conducive to an actual conversation. It's definitely not protective of a formed and helpful and inclusive discussion where you're actually going to benefit from everyone's views. If you want to advance a certain, I'm going to be done now and get off the high horse, but if you're going to really try and benefit from everyone's perspectives, you ought to make sure that everyone can speak. And signing the Chicago Statement or any other policy might be a fine start for the discussion. Actually shouldn't be the end of it.
I want to invite both of you in just a moment to respond to this disagreement in particular with respond to a question that's come in from one of our viewers thinking about some of the situations we've seen in Minnesota campuses recently. But before we do that, Sigal, I just want to ask you about one clarification. So one of the questions about, boundary negotiation is that some people are more skilled in negotiating those boundaries than others, and in particular, we rely on faculty to be better at negotiating those boundaries than undergraduates, particularly those who are first matriculating. And the Chicago Statement itself differentiates between what we expect of faculty and the unpreparedness of students to be able to engage in these conversations, and says, one of the obligations of a university is to prepare students for this kind of conversation. Do you think that there are, when you mentioned about women in science, we all might be thinking of a particular case of a faculty member from an Idaho public school. Is it different if a faculty member says that than if a student in a dorm says to his peers, well, and whether it's a woman or a man who says that, science is the domain of men? Is that having this? Are those different kinds of situations and negotiations? And what is it more harmful if a faculty? Yeah, how are those different?
Well, thank you for this, Jackie. And of course, they are different. Which is exactly why we cannot rely on one stable, given, and universal set of boundaries that should inform all of these conversations, right? I think if you have a male professor in a science class say that, if you have a university president say that women are not as successful in math and science, has a different impact. Now, what should be done about this circumstance? I mean, there are all sorts of things that can be done. Professor students might want to talk to them, the professors, maybe peers or chair might want to talk to them. I mean, so there are all sorts of solutions that we can come up with, right? And I'm not advocating canceling, so to speak, or firing people because they crossed a boundary in, any given moment, right? So this is not, the question is not, here are the boundaries, whoever crosses them, will be shot, right? The issue is, metaphorically, obviously, I would say, the issue really is, how are we thinking about the impact of our words for the purpose of our goals, right? So if as a professor of science, the impact of my words would be that fewer women will want to take this class, or fewer women will major in science. You are missing out on very talented and potentially successful people, who could do well in your class but are now feeling excluded. Like, this is one kind of impact that we would like to avoid. Whereas, if you and I are talking, over dinner, and I say something that somebody else I think is inappropriate, or you even think is inappropriate, that's a completely different context, a completely different set of boundaries. And you might tell me, this is not very nice. You say that, right? Or these ideas are quite passé, still things like that. It's a different context, right? The educational context is different than the dorm context, is different than casual conversation. Any of these, the power relations matter. To some extent, the identity of the speaker and the listeners matter. So I do have a set of considerations, let's say, for the purpose of understanding and thinking about our boundaries, including all of these and a couple of other ones, right? The identities, the impact, the intention, etc. But overall, the effort has to be to advance the shared mission. And if the mission is to advance knowledge, you ought to be able to learn from everyone, right? And faculty members, of course, have a greater responsibility to do that. And just the final point, of course, students coming in, graduate students, are not well prepared actually to do that, particularly because K-12 schools increasingly spaces where students' voice is not welcome by the practices of K-12 schools and by legal opinions regarding what students may or may not say. So there is just too much of a variety in K-12 schools, and students come in unprepared. But if we want to figure out a way to teach them how to do that, we shouldn't we should depict them as incapable of seeking. We should not depict them as incapable of having an opinion.
Sigal, the producer of the program, tells me that your audio is going out, and they're wondering if you could shut down any other apps that you have in the background. And I want to come back. I think what you've just finished saying really connects naturally to the question that has come in from this viewer, and the question of student preparedness and what faculty and institutions should do in response to students seeing an assault on their dignity. And the question, and I hope, and I'll apologize if I mispronounce the name, Raha Al-Hawari is asking, one potential difficulty I see is the gap between a theoretical principle such as dignitary safety and how the principle gets applied. For example, if a student states that viewing an image of Muhammad in an art history class violates their dignitary safety, referring to the Hamline case, or the more recent case just down the road at McAllister University, where the university responded to student concerns about an image by an Iranian American artist by putting up frosted glass and a warning before students entered the display, in this case at a museum on the campus, not a classroom setting. So I think these are terrific and parallel examples of a student sees an assault on the dignity of a group and themselves to which they belong. Sigal, I'll start with you, since you're our author today. How is it that schools should think about cases like this?
So thank you for this, and to the audience member for asking this question. I think it's really important to recognize that when a student, as in the Hamline case, is saying that they are concerned about a certain action or decision by the instructor, they should be taken seriously, right? And they should be listened to, and their concerns should be addressed. I think we have to acknowledge that in the Hemline case and others, people within that student's community might have different views, diverse views on the matter. And so the fact that one student raised a concern is not in itself conclusive, right? It's, again, a start for a discussion rather than a reason to fire the instructor, right? As the university in time recognized. And so concerns about harm, concerns about dignitary safety, concerns about the risks to inclusion should all be a part of the discussion that we are having. But the fact that a student feels uncomfortable or feels harmed or feels excluded is not in itself a reason to shut down the conversation, right? I think it's a reason to try and figure out how we can address their concern. And maybe, we find that in some cases they are right, and they need to be, there need to be some shifts or changes, and the instructor can decide to do that. We have to try and maintain the autonomy of instructors to make decisions of this sort, the autonomy of the institution to guide decisions of this sort. And we surely, just in a quick aside to a topic that I think is really important for our conversation, we should surely try to make sure that we don't have legislative efforts to restrict what professors and students may talk about.
Yeah, and I'd like to invite you in on this question of these specific examples.
Well, I'll be very brief. I too want to keep the state legislators out, but I think the Hamlin case is the perfect advertisement for the need for the Chicago principles. They may not save us, but they're needed. The McAllister case, to me, manifests the problem of negotiating, a kind of rolling negotiation of the boundaries. The president of McAllister wrote an essay, rather self-congratulatory, I thought, that emphasized this process. I think the result was as bad as Hamlin. So both of those examples just caused me to be skeptical about the possibility of setting the boundaries that we need, serving the goals of free expression and inclusion simultaneously in the way that Segal expects. Could I make one final point, and that is the high point of your book, Segal, for me, was almost at the very end. It's page 150 for those who will buy the book and look it up immediately. And there, I think you actually do return to the essence of the Calvin report principle. In other words, that the university is a community, but it's a limited kind of community dedicated to knowledge seeking. But there is a powerful form of inclusion in that community, so understood. And I think you state it beautifully and powerfully when you say there are two key things to keep in mind in teaching. The context is what professors do in class. First, everyone in class belongs, and all students' questions and comments are welcome. Second, learning is an ongoing process, which is everyone's shared goal. And then you go on to describe how intellectual generosity works. And again, I think it's powerfully expressed and beautifully expressed. And you point out at the end that such generosity requires established trust. I prefer to say that the intellectual generosity establishes the trust that we're looking for. In other words, if we practice the intellectual virtues, we will find that we get inclusion and community and inclusion in what I would argue is the highest sense of the term. So I think you were indeed channeling some residual Calvinism, if I can put it that way, at the end of the book. And I just want to say, preach, sister.
Thank you.
I'm going to continue on this question of like trust, and we have coming from our audience member Scott Ross. Let's shift from principles to policy. What policies for faculty, staff, and students should be established on campus to support knowledge creation and sharing whole respect for individual values? So thank you, Scott Ross, for the question. And I think some of these questions come up again in these harder cases. Sigal, you talked in your book about the question of pronouns, whether or not faculty should use preferred pronouns. We might think about whether students should be required to use preferred pronouns for those who are on their floor. About other cases of speakers, but starting with this question about what we see for faculty in the classroom. What are some of the practices, whether it's that you recommend, and I'll invite you to, Dan, for cultivating an inclusive setting in the classroom while letting people say things that they think they're going to be a party of one in the classroom?
Right. So, I mean, I'll just start by putting aside, I hope, the matter of pronouns. I think those are by now, either they are or they should be non-issues, right? Let's say, Jackie, that you're my student and you come to my class, and on the student list, your name appears as Jacqueline, and you tell me I go by Jackie. Would it make any sense for me to insist that I will not call you Jackie, even though that's what you want to be called? I'm going to be calling you Jacqueline or Rebecca. It doesn't make any sense, right? And I think for young people, for the most part, the matter of pronouns doesn't make any difference either. For the most part, people recognize that if a person tells you their name and their pronouns, then you just respect that. That's who they are. So this, I'm pretty much, I would like that this matter does not extend beyond simple courtesy, right? And respect for the person as they present themselves. But at the same time, the matter that you raise continues to be pressing, right, beyond this particular question, right? So what kind of requirements can we make, or what kind of policies can we make on campus such that people are able to have these open conversations? And I would suggest that these are, the issue with policies is that they might be a little bit more boring than any of the other things that we might talk about, And for example, we have a wonderful Center for Teaching and Learning, which is, there are similar centers on many, many college and university campuses. And so they offer, for example, workshops on how to deal with controversial or difficult moments and topics in the classroom, right? I don't think everyone must take, or have to be required to take these workshops. I think they should be available to anyone, from teaching assistants to professors, and people should be encouraged to consider participating in them. if they so choose, So this would be one tool, supporting these kinds of centers, workshops, in helping faculty navigate some of these treacherous terrains, right? Because increasingly in this polarized time, one of the concerns that we are seeing beyond, the legislative one that Dan and I just agreed on, one of the concerns that we are seeing coming from the ground up rather than the top-down ones is that a lot of people, both faculty and students, prefer not to touch too many topics, right? Why would I go into that? I run into trouble, somebody would get mad, I'd say the wrong word and all heck's loose, right? So people are mistrustful of each other. They don't trust even themselves that they are able to navigate these difficult contexts. And they, in this case being faculty now, oftentimes feel for a good reason that there are generational shifts in tolerance to different forms of expression. And so we're like, okay, you know what? I'll just shut up. I won't say anything about this matter. And that's not a good thing, broadly speaking. In some specific context, I think is fine. Here is a joke that you used to think is funny. It's not funny anymore. Maybe it never was funny, but definitely it's not funny to young people anymore, whatever it might be about. Just don't use it. It's okay to move on. But if there are whole topics that we are neglecting to touch because we are worried about responses, this is not very good. And so we do need to create platforms to support faculty in being able to run these conversations. There are a lot of people who are doing this, again, both for KF and higher ed instructors, and making sure that faculty knows that their administration, their leaders, their chairs, deans, and provosts have their backs, right? That they will be supported if they try in good faith to have an open discussion, even if somebody gets.
Dan, I want to bring you in. I know we're running close to the end of our time already, and I want to make sure that you have a chance to respond, and also maybe we'll have a couple more questions.
Sure. Well, on the classroom, I think the focus should always be on make the argument. I think that's a request to just continually put to a student, make the argument. Now, Sigal has much to say about the importance of being open in an inclusive community to the testimonial evidence that students want to bring to bear on questions. But I think that there's a real problem there of letting testimony about one's identity, so to speak, have some epistemological authority. And Jeremy Waldron, who believes that the harm in hate speech is a severe political problem in our society, draws the line, and he cares about protecting dignitary equality, but he draws the line at identity, and he puts it this way: if I say I identify with some opinion that I hold, if I say it's part of my identity, I elevate, or I purport to elevate, that opinion above the scrum of contestation. By saying that some belief or opinion is crucial to my identity, makes it non-negotiable, because a criticism of that opinion is then going to be an attack on me. And I think that problem is palpable on campuses. I see it. Students are not, I think, prone to give offense. They're prone to fear, above all, the possibility that they may give offense. And so, yes, they will tread sensitively and carefully as they were traversing a minefield. And I think that casts a pall on the kind of education that we want. I want to say that Sigal makes an important point about the larger so-called public life of the university, and offers this excellent advice, that the invitation to anyone to speak has to make it clear that this is an invitation into an intellectual community. And that comes with certain precise responsibilities to that community. And then she has some best practices surrounding this to recommend. But I would say that the original invitation to Charles Murray at Middlebury, in fact, fulfilled Sigal's criteria. And the fact that nevertheless Murray was shouted down should make us really worry, to the extent that we're moving back from some clear rules of the road about what is an intellectual discussion. Have we satisfied the criteria of responsibility to the community? Alison Stanger was there, as she said, loaded for bear to be an interlocutor with Murray. I don't think that the design of that program suffered from irresponsibility.
Right. So I think there are two issues here and about 2 minutes to speak about them. So we can't get too far. And I appreciate your comments about all of this, Dan. I think, first of all, in terms of identity, I think first person claims, as a woman, blah, 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 or, as a parent, right? So stating my identity as a way of clarifying the contribution that I am making as a member of a certain community or a person with a certain identity. I think it has some power, testimonial power, as well as epistemic power. I think it's limited, though. I don't think it's, again, a power that should overcome or undermine or circumvent claims that people make if they do not have the same identity. Of course, they might not know what I'm talking about, right? So if I want to say something as a woman and you want to make a counterclaim, it might have the same power or it might not, depending on what it is that we're talking about. If we're talking about women's experiences, maybe I know something more, but also maybe my perspective is narrowed by my unique experiences, right? And so somebody else who has not had them or had different ones might be able to shed light on. So I think there is room to self-identify in these ways, but it shouldn't take up all the air in the room. And again, some of the norms that we set up for conversation need to be able to account for that, and therefore reduce some of the heat around what qualifies as harm or what qualifies as a dignitary, as a dignitary risk that I'm taking by making a claim. About Murray, I will just say one thing. I think since when this event took place, a lot of students have changed their practices around protests in ways that I think are both more sophisticated and are nonviolent and are quite welcome. So I would hope that we would find ways to protect student voice, including through protests. Obviously, the extent that it's done in a legal manner, and that we maintain broad boundaries for their civic engagement, even when they have concerns about other people's speech.
Well, gosh, I wish we could continue that conversation yet further. We are already at the end of our time together, and I appreciate, as should be the case in any conversation about a book on freedom of expression in college campuses and in our democracy, that we have points of agreement and points of disagreement. So I want to thank Dan and Sigal. Thank you so much for tuning in today, or for sharing your expertise today. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in today. And the questions that were asked was, I know we weren't able to get to every single one of them. all of us at BPC know that it has been a challenging few years on college campuses. We're coming up to spring break. I hope that you have had a successful spring semester to date and are looking forward to a spring break. I want to invite everyone to subscribe to BPC's YouTube channel and to follow us on Facebook and on YouTube. We also have a Campus Free Expression newsletter that you can find more about by looking us up at bipartisanpolicy.org and subscribing to our newsletter on the Campus Free Expression page. Again, thank you very much. Take care and have a good day. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.